Well, on the charmed life front, last Tuesday I was invited to attend a committee meeting in the British Parliament that featured a panel of speakers from Syria and Lebanon discussing peace efforts in the Middle East. After passing through airport-style security and then being ushered through multiple halls and winding staircases adorned with the statues and busts of old dead white guys of England's past, we crowded into a committee room with large leaded windows looking out over the Thames, where we sat at old oak desks still festooned with the brass inkwell holders from a long past history, and tried to get comfortable in the stuffy, unair-conditioned heat of the 2-day long English summer that I enjoyed. There were many engaging presentations during that afternoon, but the one that captured my imagination was an elderly gentleman who had served as the Associate Director of Security for the Christian militia in Lebanon during their civil war. He talked about how in those days he unwaveringly ordered both the torture and the execution of Muslim prisoners without ever batting an eye. He felt no conflict internally about how wrong he was to fail to view his Muslim neighbors as fellow human beings, and in fact, to realize the unimaginable hypocrisy of killing people in the name of patriotism and, ironically, of faith. I asked him to describe his conversion from being an enthusiastic militant to being an ardent advocate for peace, because predictably these changes don't happen all at once. There are very few sudden conversions to anything that have much substance to them. It was for him, predictably, a gradual journey, largely marked by unavoidable realizations that some specific people that you thought you hated turned out to be really good people. And that begins to crack the shell of the certainty of that kind of prejudice that makes it possible for a human being to really change. Now, most of us straight people here can remember a time when we just blithely accepted the teaching of the church and of society that condemned homosexuality. And we might have remained comfortable with that prejudice had we not come to the realization that someone that was a close friend or a member of our family that we already really loved was a member of that club. And you begin to feel, if you've got any heart at all, you begin to feel the cognitive dissonance that says, I cannot condemn the essence of a person that I know to be a good person, someone that I genuinely care about. And so just as most of us have traveled that journey over the past couple of decades, these guys who had participated in murder and torture and civil war were trying to say to the people in Syria who are presently engaged in torture and murder and civil war that they deeply regret their past, that they wish they could help these others now to open their eyes to see what they found out too late after they had already committed unspeakable crimes against their own neighbors. Now, there's a paradox here. One side of the paradox is that intelligent people, many of whom have basically good hearts, can be so blinded by prejudice that they can engage in the worst things that human beings do. Can you even imagine ordering a captured prisoner tortured? Can you even imagine doing that? But people will do that, this fellow said, to defend his Christian faith, to defend the society that he believes should be predominantly Christian. And that kind of thing can make me so sad when you hear politicians standing up after a school shooting and defending gun ownership, even AR-15s that have been used repeatedly in mass murders, you just get so sad that giving up starts to make sense. But the other side of that paradox is the hope that people not only can change, but that some people change entirely, not just in degrees, but some people move from one extreme all the way over to the other, from a place of the most evil imaginable hypocrisy to a place of almost saintly enlightenment and self-sacrifice. Now, like a lot of you, I often feel quite beaten down by the news, so heartbroken by yet another school shooting, about the violence in Palestine, the disassembling of environmental regulations, the growing income disparity, not just in the United States, but in Great Britain and in Europe and probably even in Northern Africa. It feels hopeless, doesn't it? It feels daunting. And I'm 61, and I start to have fantasies of retirement, of going someplace where I can indulge myself in the don't give a damn phase of life. Just get to a place where I'm not just constantly locked into all of these things. Doesn't it seem like the popularity of mindless entertainment, distraction, denial, that you can get 8 hours of coverage of an extremely expensive wedding of an apparently nice couple, not the only nice couple in the world, but that I saw journalists that I used to take seriously literally jumping up and down with excitement about the appearance of cakes and hats. And you think, well, yeah, a part of me wishes that I had ever learned to watch football or basketball and to care who won a game. You know, just something to take the pressure off. Doesn't that sound inviting? Now, a lifetime ago, I was married. I recognize how hard that is to believe. But there was a time in my life when I was married, and one night, my wife and I went out for a dinner together in our favorite restaurant. And as often happened in those days, our private moment was interrupted by a stranger who came up to the table to talk about one of my newspaper columns. And this time it was a positive interruption. The middle-aged woman came up to the table and drew a laminated copy of one of my columns out of her purse and said, "This column changed my life, and I carry it with me every day, and I get as many people as I can to read it." Now, writers live for those moments. As Mark Twain said, compliments are always difficult to respond to. They don't leave you with an adequate response because it always seems like there's so much more that they could have said. But this ebullient fan walked away, and as soon as she was out of hearing, my wife hissed at me, "You are not important. No one listens to your sermons. Your articles don't change anyone's opinions. You are wasting your life." Now, as mean as that may sound to you, said just that way, folks, she was mostly right, wasn't she? No. Most people don't listen, and people generally don't change much if they change at all. A few of my articles ended up laminated and being important to people, but most of them went to the bottom of a birdcage before they were ever even read. If you are an author and you think you might be important, go on Amazon.com and check for the sales of used copies of your book. Some for 17 cents. And they will add the insulting descriptor, autographed by the author. And you may think I would order that book to find out who I had autographed that for. But trust me, I don't want to know if it was you. I don't want to know. But folks, let me encourage you, as rare as it is for anyone to pay attention, as rare as it is for people to change, you just look around this room. What are there, 40, 50 people here? Not very many people. But unless you're lost, the only reason you're here is because you are a progressive thinker. Amen. With decidedly liberal views on almost every topic, and yet it is extremely likely that not a one of us was raised to be a socialist. My parents were Democrats, but they were George Wallace kind of Democrats. They weren't the Bernie Sanders sort. So how can you let yourselves believe that your right-wing neighbors, your fundamentalist family members, your conservative co-workers cannot ever change if you yourself are evidence of the fact that people can change? So here's our own paradox. We want to change the world. We want the world to become better. We want the world to be more fair, more just, more liberal. But at the same time, we really don't want to be bothered with the unpleasantness of having to be constantly informed about all of the horrible things that are going on in the world. Now, folks, isn't it obvious that you can't have it both ways? Ignorance doesn't change the world. It doesn't. Disengagement, cynicism, escapism, isolation, denial only plays into the hands of the people who are trying to turn our 200-year-old democracy into a fascist dictatorship. And yes, I said fascist dictatorship, and I mean it. We took as the theme of our church when we started 10 years ago, Elie Wiesel's quote, "Thou shalt not stand idly by." In the same speech in which he delivers this line, he said that neutrality never serves the oppressed. It always serves the oppressor. If you don't get involved, if you don't take sides, you are ipso facto on the side of evil. You are ipso facto on the side of the oppressors. 2 weeks ago, jet-lagged and trying desperately to make it successfully through my first day of lectures in my lecture tour, I was at St. Albans, a suburb of London. And at the very end of the day, I'd been on my feet for 6 hours talking, taking questions and answers, and in the very last question and answer period, when it was almost time to go home and have a warm beer, inexplicably, a woman who did not appear to be tired at all said, "Dr. Ray, you haven't even mentioned Palestine. What should be done about Israel and Palestine?" Now, mind you, the lectures I delivered that day were on panentheism, the historical Jesus, and envisioning the future of the church. I think I can be forgiven for having not delivered my 8-point plan to end hostilities in the Gaza Strip. No one in the room budged. It was time to leave, but no one was getting up and making motions towards the door. So I was virtually trapped. I had no decent escape plan. I had no alternative but to tell them what I think, which in my case turns out to be a good thing. I've always believed that the whole world has a right to my opinion. So I told them what I truly believe in my heart, that the Holocaust was one of the worst crimes of modern history. It is right up there with a short list of 3 or 4 absolutely horrible events in human history. But it was a European sin. And it was a European sin that was resolved by stealing Middle Eastern land that had been predominant Muslim territory almost from the time of Muhammad. A European sin should have been resolved with European real estate. And the reason that we took Middle Eastern land was because British and American Sunday school classes had talked forever about the Holy Land and the Promised Land as related only to the Jews. That means you haven't read the Quran very deeply. In the Quran, if a territory has been ruled by a Muslim government, it must always be ruled by a Muslim government. So one religious claim said this is Jewish territory. Another religious claim said this is Muslim territory. But in my Sunday school classes, we never talked about what the Quran said. And in the 1940s, fundamentalist Christians simply were unaware of history, of religion, of cultures, and evidently of ethics, because they just took their land. I mean, the Israeli armies went into villages, told all the men they had to come to a meeting at a certain place, and while the men were in the meeting, the other soldiers went to the homes and told the women and children that they could take whatever they could pack and carry away in an hour. And after that hour, they were never allowed back in their own homes again, as fleeing European Jews were put in those houses. Now, if you sell your house, if you make that decision, I'm going to sell my house, you sign on a contract, you agree to take a certain amount of money, you got nothing to complain about. You decided you sold your house, it's not your house anymore. But if soldiers show up at your house and force you to leave your home, perhaps a home where you and your ancestors have lived and farmed for longer than anyone can remember, they don't even offer to buy it from you, they just take it from you. How long would it take you to get okay with that? I mean, seriously. Would you get over it in a few years, maybe a decade or two? Countries have been invading and occupying countries throughout history. I mean, even traveling in England, British people are always happy to tell you about a pre-Norman church or structure or something. And that was 1,000 years ago. And they're still a little miffed about William the Conqueror. It's not hard to find someone who will reference him as William the something else. White people have been pushing Native Americans off of their land in North America for centuries. But you may be aware that there is still no small amount of dissent about that. There are a number of Native Americans that 200 years later are not satisfied with the deal that they got. How long then should it take the dispossessed of Palestine to accept the theft of their homeland? It's been 70 years now, but it still seems to be quite wrong. And a part of why it is wrong is because it's still going on. Let me share this historically sequenced map with you. On the far left, you see Israel as it was established through the British Protectorate in 1946. Tiny, tiny pieces of land for the fleeing Jews from Europe. But after wars and attacks, Jerusalem or Israel kept taking territory from those that attacked them and keeping it. So you see the yellow area on the far left was where Israel started, and on the far right is where it is now. And Palestinians are being forced into encampments in those small green areas that are either fenced or walled off. And the one on the left side is the Gaza Strip, which is now one of the most densely populated places on earth. It has become an open-air prison where people are just shoved into that space. Now, this was done out of a fundamentalist Christian Sunday school belief that it ought to be done. Backed by Great Britain and the United States, when Arab nations tried to reclaim occupied land, they were beaten back, and Israel just kept getting bigger. I don't want to make light of this, but there's an old joke that says, Israel wants peace. Israel wants a piece of Jordan, and a piece of Syria, and a piece of Lebanon, and a piece of Egypt. Now, I actually have a certain sympathy with the state of Israel. I believe that given centuries of oppression, exile, and genocide, that the Jews did deserve to have a homeland, a self-governed homeland where they could be safe. Israel has a right to exist. I just don't think they have a right to exist where they are. I just don't think that's their land. And saying that is what makes me nervous about talking about it among strangers. I mean, I really don't like to get this question in a room full of people that I don't know. Anyone who even slightly implies that this particular piece of real estate does not belong to the Jewish state is immediately portrayed by Israelis as being anti-Semitic, or worse. Even the Quaker Church has been accused of supporting terrorists because they have been critical of the Israeli oppression of Palestinians. And it's true that regardless of how wrong-headed the original land theft was, it has ended up putting Jews in a place that's very difficult to defend, a place where they are surrounded by hostile neighbors who do not want them there, and they're given nowhere else to go. I can understand that they have a need to secure their home and their cities. There have been offenses on both sides, and Palestinian opposition groups know how to grab sympathy through the media. This is just what Martin Luther King Jr. did. This is what Gandhi did. They recognize that if they can be shown being brutally treated by their oppressors in the media, if you can get in the media and be seen to being mistreated, you can gain public support and win the public opinion battle. But that being said, their reasons for the protest are not simply rooted in trying to win a public opinion war. Gaza, as I said, has literally become an open-air prison. With each regional war, Israel has expanded its territory, but in much more subtle ways, they have engaged in land grabs through expanding settlements into Palestinian territory. Those who remain in Palestinian enclaves are having their living conditions constantly eroded through Israeli government actions. The government cuts off access to clean water so that 95% of the people living in this super crowded Gaza Strip do not have access to safe drinking water. Can you imagine giving your babies dirty water? They cut off electrical power except for 4 hours a day. Can you imagine trying to keep your food and things safe in a tropical environment with only 4 hours of electricity a day? They keep unemployment at nearly 50%, and the jobs that are available to them require the ability to cross into Israel to basically shine the boots of Israeli soldiers. They're low-paying jobs, and if they've got any kind of infraction against you, you are restricted from travel across those border points, so that people are literally trapped in a densely populated open-air prison that they are not allowed to leave and where they cannot find work, resulting in this final and unimaginable statistic that 50% of children express no will to live. Now, you think about the elementary school age kids that you know or have known. Happy, playful, can't wait for recess. But kids that age saying that they have no desire to live. That, my friends, is why Palestinian protesters are willing to gather at the borders and to stand their ground even while they're being shot by snipers. And yes, I said snipers. As the Trump delegation gathered in Jerusalem to dedicate the new American embassy, protesters gathered at the border of Gaza, and that day, 58 men, women, and children were shot dead, and between 1,300 and 2,000 were wounded. Now, why didn't they use tear gas if they were massing at the border? Well, because they were too far away from the border to shoot tear gas canisters. And you think, snipers, why didn't they use rubber bullets? Well, because they were too far away for rubber bullets to work. They were killed by snipers who were shooting from hundreds of yards away, shooting indiscriminately into large crowds of protesters. So yeah, there are offenses on both sides. But it's gotten to be kind of like when people say that scientists don't agree on global climate change. 98% of scientists agree. The other 2% usually work for the coal and oil industry, or they're stupid. There's some of that. Yeah, it's like, yeah, well, one side's being honest and they're informed, and the other side is being dishonest and they are uninformed. So there are offenses on both sides, and Israel does have a right to defend their borders. But the offenses on the Israeli side of the equation make it look like, over a century's time, they have moved from being the victims of Nazis to acting like Nazis themselves. And we need to be clear about this, because you're not going to hear this in commercial media. Our corporate media almost never tells the truth about Israeli offenses. If you ever want to understand the hatred that Islamic fundamentalists have for Americans, you can put at the top of the list the American support for the human rights abuses of Israel against Palestine. And that is a fact. There was no reason at this time to move the American embassy to Jerusalem, other than the fact that it was done to deeply please American Christian fundamentalists. And it was a payoff to Zionist political donors such as Sheldon Adelson, the casino magnate, who was there for the dedication of the embassy. And by the way, they haven't actually built an embassy in Jerusalem. They took property we already owned and renamed it. There's been no construction. They say they're going to tear it down and build an embassy. It was a purely political statement. Had nothing to do with structures or geography. It had everything to do with politics. So last month, the former evangelical writer Michael Gerson wrote a column in The Atlantic in which he said, according to Jerry Falwell Jr., evangelicals have now found their dream president, which says something about the current quality of evangelical dreams. As I observed a few weeks ago, evangelicals have given Trump a pass on a whole host of illegal and immoral failings, largely due to the prospects of getting at least one more young anti-abortion jurist nominated to the Supreme Court. Everything else he does appears to not matter as long as they have hope of taking over the Supreme Court. But right next to that anti-abortion cycloptic perspective is a fundamentalist love of the state of Israel that was born in far-right Sunday school classes. The two American pastors the Trump administration chose to send to Israel to speak at the dedication of the embassy, Robert Jeffries and John Hagee, were not there because they are friends of the Jews. Jeffries has clearly said repeatedly that Jews cannot be saved, and John Hagee said that Hitler was doing God's will. Their interest in Israel is motivated not out of concern for a Jewish homeland, but out of their belief that the reestablishment of the state of Israel and the much hoped for rebuilding of the Jewish temple on Mount Moriah would bring about the apocalypse described in the book of Revelation, an apocalypse in which all of the Jews and Muslims and everyone but a narrowly defined clan of right-wing Christians will be killed. So the Jewish folks at this dedication, while they were glad it was happening because they were thumbing their nose at the Palestinians, were also aware that these Christians were saying, you're just pawns in a big play, and we're looking forward to the day that you're slaughtered. Satisfying people who were locked into this irrational, magical, superstitious, though self-aggrandizing way of thinking is what started this whole mess with Israel in the 1940s. And yet, ignorant of history, ignorant of foreign policy, ignorant of world religions, or even the otherness of other people, Trump stumbles into decisions that cost other people their lives. Amen. He claims to be a great negotiator, but what great negotiator ever plays a trump card for no reason at all? He might have offered to move our embassy to Jerusalem in exchange for Israel withdrawing some of their settlements out of Palestinian territory. In fact, Obama and Bush had proposed exactly that. But to just do it for nothing but to give a tip of the hat to crazy fundamentalists, that kind of immaturity and self-serving leadership quite predictably lit the fuse of a conflict between a heavily armed Israeli army and a rock-throwing crowd of Palestinians. 58 Palestinians are dead. 1,300 others were wounded. What was the casualty count on Israel's side? Israel says the Palestinians were dangerous. They were violent. How come there wasn't a single Israeli injury? Not one. Evangelicals now have the president they've dreamed of, but the whole world is being subjected to a nightmare. Now, I know that hope is not a plan, just being hopeful. Hope is not a theology. Hope is not a faith. However, I do find reasonable hope in the stark light that is being shined on evangelical thinking in this era of Trump. Now that we have a president who is morally reprehensible and almost certainly guilty of economic crimes that will rise to the level of treason, sincere thinking evangelicals are finally taking a look at themselves and their religion. And though it may be hard to believe, some of their leaders are beginning to wake up and realize that they have been seduced by a fraud. Evangelical Christianity has had a stranglehold on our government for almost all of its 2 centuries of history. And we have lived through the worst of it as the moral majority put Reagan in office in 1980. And now we are seeing thoughtful defections from a camp of many prominent journalists and politicians who now are recognizing the need to separate themselves from the unholy marriage of the religious right and the Republican Party. We have a White House right now that has arrayed itself in a virtual war against civil rights, against the poor, against the gay community, against immigrants, even against the planet where we live. But like those thousands of Palestinians who stood their ground even in a hail of sniper bullets, we cannot allow ourselves to get bored or to retreat to cynicism or to just get tired of it all and just give up. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We have seen many of our most closely held values challenged very seriously over the last 2 years. But folks, we never signed up for the little league kind of religion. We came to play in the pros, and we are here to win. In the fight for social justice, I will borrow the ancient Greek expression that says, I will remain on the battlefield until I walk off carrying my shield or I'm being carried on it. The strength of our commitment is not a simple matter of preference of religion. It comes from knowing that we have taken the side of justice, and there is no retreat from that field.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.